We are diving back into the world of Fanny Bartanix and her experiences as documented. And last time, if you were with us, we know that Fanny was in a very, very difficult place.
Yeah, things weren't looking so good for Fanny.
Yeah, her mother's just ongoing suffering was just weighing on her so heavily, and her relationship had just ended after her boyfriend had moved to Spain. And then on top of all that, she was just utterly lost and unhappy living in the UK. Just not a good spot to be.
No, not at all. And it just seems like the UK was just, not the place for her. She really didn't like it there.
No.
And we'll dive more into that. But as we go through this next part of her journey, Fanny's struggles, they get even more intense and pretty dark, really. She ends up moving to Norway and then later to Sweden. And there are some brief moments where things seem to get a little bit better, but then those familiar, difficulties come right back. And it all kind of culminates in this really dark period where, she's really thinking seriously about suicide. But then something happens. There's this turning point.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to get into today.
Exactly.
So our mission is to try to understand, what exactly were the things that really contributed to Fanny getting to this really, really low point in her life.
Right.
And then what was that unexpected catalyst for change that kind of came out of nowhere?
Yeah, because it really is quite remarkable. And she really vividly describes her mother's negativity, and this feeling of just utter helplessness as her mother's constantly recounting the same stories over and over again, about her loneliness and the pain that she's experiencing.
It's so heavy. Yeah.
It is. It's heavy. And it really paints a really powerful picture of what we could call emotional engulfment. It's not just the content of the negativity, but it's this feeling of just being kind of trapped in that emotional space with her mother.
Yeah.
And unable to offer any kind of respite, and unable for Fanny to find her own footing. So it's this shared sense of helplessness, really. And she says this, she articulates it so clearly. When she says, I couldn't help anyone by being on the same boat and sinking with them. I could only help if I was on dry land, but I was sinking too.
That's such a heavy image, and that feeling of being pulled down by someone else's pain. While you're also struggling yourself, it really resonates.
Totally. And I think what compounded all of this was just her deep dissatisfaction with being in the UK in the first place.
Totally. She did not like it there.
No, it wasn't a place that she chose. It was a place she moved to for her boyfriend. And she hated the weather. She hated the food. It just wasn't for her. And she says, at one point she says, a country where it rains 200 days out of 365 is not a country for me. I think that really captures just her feeling of being out of place, And I think that feeling of just being trapped in this place that she didn't want to be in must have just really amplified her despair.
Yeah. And then you add on top of that, an unfulfilling job and her sister returning home.
Oh, right.
And the sister, she's starting to be affected by her mother's depression.
Yeah.
It's like this whole family unit, is just being weighed down by this negativity. And then amidst all of this, her relationship with Chris, geographically distant, is very clearly coming to an end.
Yeah. And it's almost it's on life support.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of limping along. And then the inevitable happens, in November when she gets that definitive breakup message.
Yeah, the plug is pulled.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And it's interesting to consider that this breakup message, while it was obviously, painful for her, it seemed to act as a trigger for her to finally decide, okay, I've got to get out of the UK.
Yeah.
It's almost like that final severing of ties, even though it was something she didn't want, it liberated her to at least consider, all right, there needs to be an alternative path here.
Yeah.
Even if she doesn't know what that path is yet.
Right.
There's that need.
Totally. And then she takes that pretty decisive action.
Yeah.
She gets that message from Chris and just immediately hands in her 4-week notice.
Yeah.
And then she packs up and drives back to Hungary.
Yeah, right before Christmas.
Right before Christmas.
Right on top of Christmas. And what's really fascinating here is what happens with Chris next, Despite the fact that they've broken up, he still goes to Budapest, as was planned.
Yeah.
And they end up seeing each other and going on dates and even spending nights together.
What?
I know. It's like, what is going on?
It's so confusing.
Yeah. It really speaks to the fact that she was just like lacked any kind of, direction at this point. And she even says this. She says, like, life was just happening to me without my control or active participation, And so I think this really underscores how vulnerable she was at this time. I mean, I think it's almost as if this unresolved connection with Chris, coupled with how unhappy she was in the UK, it created this kind of perfect storm, this instability, that led her to make some of these kind of impulsive decisions that really in many ways don't make sense.
It's like she was clinging to something familiar, even though it was clearly not good for her anymore.
Right, exactly. And then this is where we get to this what seems like completely illogical decision.
To move to Norway.
Yeah. Of all places.
It's so cold. I know. She hates the cold.
I know. This is a woman who hates the cold.
This is a woman who hates the cold.
And she decides, you know what? I'm going to move to Norway. It really is fascinating.
I love that she just straight up acknowledges it, though.
Yeah. She totally calls herself out on it. She's like, the woman who hated being cold all the time decided to relocate to Norway. That's how much sense I was making at the time. And I think that just highlights just how, desperate she was for something different. Maybe that's the key. Just like anything but this, anything but what I'm experiencing right now.
Yeah.
Doesn't even have to make sense. It's just, I got to get out of this situation.
Just a desperate lunge for change. It seems like.
Even if there's not a clear plan. And then, of course, the reality of Norway, it sets in very quickly.
Oh, yeah.
It's just way too expensive.
Yeah. Sticker shock.
So she ends up, getting on a bus and going to Gothenburg, Sweden, where thankfully she's got someone she knows.
Yeah.
Who can give her a place to stay for a little while.
Right.
So at least, there's a little bit of support there. But it's really remarkable that she was able to just like navigate all these practical challenges.
It is. It really is.
In her state.
It speaks to her resilience, I think.
Yes.
There's this underlying resilience that even when things are really bad, she's still able to figure things out.
Yeah. And then there's this really great development that happens.
Yeah, this is a nice, bright spot.
Yeah, a little ray of sunshine.
Mm-hmm.
She gets a job as a chef.
Yeah.
Even though she has zero experience.
Right. And it's amazing. She basically just shows up and this head chef is like, all right, I'll give you a chance.
Come on in.
Come on in. Let's see what you got.
Yeah.
And she just learns on the job and she's good at it.
Yeah.
And she even says, that's how I learned to become a chef.
It's pretty awesome. And it seems like this new challenge, this accomplishment, of learning this new skill, it really had a positive impact on her mental state.
Oh, absolutely. Around March of 2014, she talks about, how she starts smiling again and even her sleep paralysis and her night terrors, they start to go away.
Oh, wow.
And while she still has insomnia, you get this sense that things are starting to look up a little bit.
Yeah, like there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems like this new environment and this new skill, it's providing a much needed like distraction and a sense of achievement.
Totally. And a sense of like purpose,
Yeah, definitely. This improvement is sadly temporary.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's temporary.
Yeah. Chris comes back to Gothenburg in April.
Oh boy.
And he's hoping they can get back together, but they end up falling back into those same like bad habits, those same like unhealthy patterns.
Yeah. And it's just a reminder, a stark reminder of just how difficult it is to break free from those unhealthy patterns. Especially, when you have these underlying stressors like her mother's situation.
Yeah.
That hasn't been resolved.
Right.
And she's still living in Scandinavia, so it's still the long dark winters,
Right. Yeah.
So there's all that going on. And so as you can imagine, with Chris coming back, and those old relationship dynamics kind of reappearing, well, all those negative symptoms just come right back. She says the screaming returned, the hallucinations returned, the fear was deeper than ever before. Yeah. And she talks about this feeling of being trapped in this cycle.
Yeah.
And she even references that movie Cube as an analogy.
Yeah. For those who don't know, it's a movie about these people who are trapped in these rooms that all look the same, and they can't get out.
Right.
And it's just it's a metaphor for that feeling of like repeating the same struggles,
Totally.
over and over again, but in different contexts.
Exactly. Exactly. And she even says, different faces, different places, same shit over and over again. I want it out. I mean, that really sums it up, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
And this is when she really hits rock bottom. For about 6 months, she's barely able to get out of bed.
Oh, wow.
And she describes herself, when she looks in the mirror, she sees an empty shell. and she says that she felt like death was around the corner.
Yeah.
And it's just a really harrowing description of severe depression, And when you think about it, it really highlights the cumulative effect of all these different stressors in her life. You've got the unresolved family issues, the difficult relationship, and this feeling of just being displaced, not really belonging anywhere. And so all of that just kind of comes together, and it creates this profound sense of hopelessness.
It's so much to carry. It's just so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's even, what's really chilling actually is that she's actually starting to think about like actually ending her life.
Yeah, the suicide, the contemplation of suicide, it's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, and she's not just having like fleeting thoughts, She's actually planning. Like she's meticulously going through all these different methods in her head. To try to figure out like what's the most bulletproof way to do this, and also a way that won't harm anyone else. She's really trying to think it through, and she rules out jumping, she rules out pills, fire, water. I mean, the level of detail that she goes into really underscores just how deep her despair was and how determined she was to actually end her life. It's pretty scary, really.
It is. It's really scary to think about someone being in that headspace.
Totally. And it's at this point, she's reached this absolute lowest point, and she's consumed with these plans for suicide. But then something kind of unexpected happens, and it becomes, in a way, it becomes the catalyst for her to change. And what happens is that her boyfriend confesses to cheating on her with their flatmate.
Oh my God.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's like on top of everything else.
Salt in the wound.
Totally. But the thing is, this confession, as painful as it was, it actually triggers something unexpected in her.
Yeah.
And even though she's got this suicide plan in place and it seems like, she's ready to go, she suddenly becomes very scared of her own plans.
It's almost paradoxical.
Yeah, it is. It's like, she's been working up the courage to end her life. But then when she's actually confronted with the reality of it, it's like, wait a minute, do I really want to do this? And I think what happens is she realizes that this courage that she's been searching for, that she's been, trying to find to end her life, it can actually be redirected.
Yeah.
She can use that same willpower, that same determination to actually choose life,
Right.
It's pretty amazing. And she says, the entire focus shifted.
Yeah.
It's like a light bulb went off in her head, and it's almost as if, being confronted with the finality of her plan, it made her realize the inherent value of the life that she was about to discard.
Yeah. It's such a powerful moment because it's like she's been looking at everything from one perspective.
Right.
And then suddenly she shifts, and it's like she's seeing everything for the first time again. And it's full of potential.
Yeah. It's full of hope.
Yeah.
And then, this shift leads her to discover the emotional attachment theory.
Wow.
And it's almost like this lifeline appears just when she needs it most.
Yeah.
And so for those who don't know emotional attachment theory, it's essentially exploring how our early relationships, with our primary caregivers, shape our later relationship patterns and also our emotional responses.
Right.
And so for Fanny, understanding these dynamics, it probably really shed a lot of light on her relationship with her mother.
Right.
And maybe even her romantic relationships, And she talks about how every sentence, in this theory, it resonated with her and how it helped her to understand herself and her background in a really profound way. And she says, it was tailor-made support for me to choose life instead of death.
That's so powerful, and it really highlights the power of understanding ourselves.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a magic cure or anything.
Right.
but it provided a framework for her experiences.
Yeah.
It gave her a way to make sense of her pain. And it's like from there,
Right.
she goes on this deep dive into psychology.
Yeah, she takes this free online course, and she completes it like 5 or 6 times,
Wow.
So it's like, it really became like a form of self-therapy for her, and it wasn't just about, acquiring knowledge, but it was about actually engaging with these ideas that were directly addressing her inner turmoil,
Yeah.
you know?
So what do you think, like what aspects of psychology do you think like really resonated with her the most at that point?
Well, I mean, clearly the emotional attachment theory, it gave her this framework, for understanding some of these long-standing patterns in her relationships and in her own emotional responses. And I think, that can be incredibly validating for people to finally, have that aha moment, like, oh, my struggles, they're not random.
Right.
There's actually a reason why I'm experiencing these things.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a root.
Exactly.
It's not just this is who I am and I'm broken. It's like, no, there's a reason why I feel this way, and there's things that I can do to change it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this thirst for knowledge that she developed, it doesn't stop there.
Right.
She also starts exploring other areas that she's interested in, like animal behavior, writing, social psychology, and it becomes this way for her to actively distract herself from those suicidal thoughts. She's like, as long as I'm learning, as long as my mind is engaged, I'm not thinking about ending my life. It's a pretty powerful illustration of how just engaging our minds can be a crucial coping mechanism.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's like if you're just sitting there stewing in your own thoughts, that's when things can get really dark.
Totally.
And so, if you can find something, that really captures your interest, engages your mind, it can really make a difference.
Yeah. And I think this highlights a really important point for listeners, which is that, if you're struggling with these negative thoughts, sometimes the best thing you can do is just to actively engage your mind with new information.
Yeah.
It can give you that much needed distraction from those negative thought patterns, and it can even, spark new perspectives, new ways of looking at things.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about distraction for Fanny. It was also about actively trying to break those negative patterns that she had developed.
Yeah.
The self-blame, the self-shame, the guilt. She talks about it as this constant battle, against these ingrained tendencies, and this conscious effort to choose a different path, to actually take responsibility for her own life. And she says, I made a decision to live, so no more excuses.
That's powerful.
And this newfound sense of agency even extends to confronting her fears.
Yeah.
Moving abroad used to be a huge source of anxiety for her, but now she feels this calling to go back to her roots, to face what she's been running from.
Yeah, and it's a remarkable transformation. It's fueled by this internal shift in perspective and this growing understanding of herself. And so we see Fanny go from this deep, profound despair, actively planning her suicide, to finding this initial spark of hope and a reason to live by understanding herself and the mechanisms of her own mind.
Yeah.
It's really a powerful testament to the human capacity for change.
It is.
Even in the darkest of circumstances.
It's so inspiring.
Yeah. And I think, the key takeaway for you, the listener, is that unexpected redirection of her will, that courage that she thought she needed to end her life. It was actually the very thing that she needed to start living it.
Yeah.
And Sövik Begseyev tells us that the next episode of Hitchhike is going to explore what she does with this new found courage and will to live.
Right.
So it's really interesting to think about that. It's like, what choices might we make when we reach our own turning points in life?
Yeah. It's a good question.
And maybe the most resonant thought to leave you with today is to consider the power of understanding ourselves.
Yeah.
Sometimes that unexpected piece of knowledge, that new perspective, it can be the most potent catalyst for change, even when things feel utterly hopeless.
Yeah.
you know? So I guess a good question to ask yourself is like, what areas of knowledge might hold unexpected keys to understanding your own experiences?
That's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, it's definitely something to ponder.